I'm kind of sitting next to the street right now, so background noise inbound. Hello everybody, welcome to the Wonky Angle, where I talk about electronic music, both new and old. And today I'm doing a Redux review of Calvin Harris's Funk Wave Bounces Volume 1. Alright, I'm sure the existence of this video is going to confuse people. I already reviewed this album once before, back when it came out in 2017. Why am I covering it again? This isn't like the time I redid my Porter Robinson Worlds review, thanks to me having way more to say about it years after the facts. I kinda alluded to my thoughts when I recently did my video on this album's sequel, and they're not that complicated. No, the reason I'm here covering this album again is because the original video got a copyright strike. Not a claim, those happen every now and then. It got a full-on takedown. I think only the third or fourth time this has ever happened in the channel's 7+ year history. And I will actually not be keeping the original video on YouTube for the reasons I'll get into. If you're really curious about what used to be there, I've re-uploaded the original to Vimeo. There will be a link to that in the description. But if you wanted to know how a 5-year-old review actually got to this point where it's being taken down now, it's a bit of a long story, but since it's interesting and might be helpful for anyone trying to make similar content to mine, I'll share it anyway. Skip to this timecode if you're not in the mood for whinging about YouTube's back end. So, I'm sure people have noticed that I always play the music from the album I'm reviewing in the background of my videos, and truth be told, I almost never actually get in copyright trouble for it. A big part of that is purely the fact that most of the artists I cover are fairly niche and unlikely to get dinged by bots in the first place. But I've always included background music in a really specific way in order to make sure that it qualifies as fair use. I obviously keep it low volume to make sure that what I'm saying is in the focus and not the music itself. I only use a couple of tracks to minimize the amount of possible claims I might get. That's why I don't just overlay every track over every time I talk about a track. That, and it's easier to edit that way. And of course, I make sure that no track ever gets played out in its full entirety. None of this stuff necessarily keeps the bots at bay, but it does give me more and more legal justification for directly disputing and fighting every claim that I get, and significantly increases my chances of actually getting the disputes through. Because, again, fair use, I have a very obvious reason of doing that. Now, this was admittedly a lot less of the case back in 2017, because back then I wasn't making money on this channel at all. No ad revenue, no Patreon, nothing. I was just doing it for fun. Claims were still really rare for me back then too, so I felt somewhat comfortable with, say, letting a track play out in its full entirety, especially given I thought said track was the best track on the album by a long shot. And since said track was a big hit in the radio, well, the obvious happened, and I just let the claim sit there. Like, 'cause even though I still think my use of Slide qualifies as fair use, since it was obviously at a low volume the whole time and it cannot act as a replacement to the original in any way, I was only like 99% sure instead of 100% sure. And I knew that one of the core factors of fair use, which is not using any more of a given work than absolutely necessary, would be a little more difficult to argue. But of course, fast forward to now, I had recently got a similar long-standing claim for my very first review of Galantis Pharmacy successfully resolved. I'd left that claim there since uploading it in 2015, having not understood the copyright system at all back then, and after actually pursuing and disputing it, I was able to get the claim off. And I would have thought I had less grounds for that one, because my editing was way worse back then than it was in 2017, obviously. So while I was gearing up to review Funk Wave Bounces Volume 2, I set myself up to dispute the claim on this old video as well. And you can obviously tell how well that went. Now, what I should have done from here was let the strike go through and file a counter notification, because that's what I did when my top 20 Avalanches songs video went down. But I was kind of dumb about the way I handled this. I remembered how it took, several weeks to get that Avalanches video out of limbo, and thought there might be an easier, more short-term way to fix it. YouTube offered grayed out options to mute the song that I thought might possibly be acceptable and wanted to test out, and I assumed they were grayed out because I had a strike pending, so I stupidly clicked cancel appeal. And not only did this not reactivate the option to remove the song, it didn't give me any more options at all. It permanently froze the claim on the video and made it so that I would never be able to take any further action against it again without deleting the video outright. So that's what I'm going to be doing. I could let the claim continue to sit. It's not like the video is going to be like removed if I didn't do anything about it. But I also don't want any more money to go towards either the major labels, the rights companies who abuse the system, or for that matter, Calvin Harris himself, who, as a side note, I've learned might have a bit of a fragile ego. Like, he actually has me blocked on Twitter. I doubt Calvin Harris knows anything about this particular copyright nonsense because the artists themselves typically aren't involved in YouTube's back end and they outsource it to other companies and stuff. Regardless, all of this is why I've seen fit to re-record and rewrite my old review 5 years later. And since I was here, I decided to look back on this album with some slightly updated thoughts. My opinion on it has marginally shifted since the time it came out, which is to say, I think this album is a fair bit worse than I initially gave it credit for. So to bring back context, for those who, say, might be watching this in the Calvin Harris playlist I have, so Calvin Harris had done the impossible and actually gotten me excited about an album of his leading up to its release. Now, sure, his previous album, Motion, was terrible, but he had followed up that with a string of singles I enjoyed a fair bit more, and moved away from the overblown EDM style he was sticking to for something a bit more laid back and deep house-ish. Cuts like How Deep Is Your Love, This Is What You Came For, and my personal favorite, My Way. He was actually starting to get back in my good graces, and that finally came full circle when he released Slide with Frank Ocean and Migos, which I thought was legit great. And I still think is a great track to this day. And unlike the My Way type singles, which fell more within the trends of the time, Slide didn't sound like anything else out at the time. Not just because of the moody but summery disco instrumental, which might have been built around his trademark piano chords, which I've always had a soft spot for, but had so much more of an organic touch in all the funk guitars and 80s drumming that set itself apart from anything he'd released up to that point. But it also really stood out because it featured Frank Ocean and Migos. Like, Calvin Harris had done collaborations with artists from the hip-hop world before, with like his tracks with Dizzy Rascal, Big Sean, or Tiny Tempa, but those are all pretty energetic rappers who could make party-friendly material and would have made sense over EDM instrumentals. Frank Ocean and Migos made way moodier and more downbeat music, also had two extremely different styles that you wouldn't think would complement each other, and the fact that they were all working with someone like Calvin Harris sounded ridiculous on paper. And yet it worked. It all came together. They didn't feel out of place at all over this instrumental and even had some solid chemistry together. I still think this track holds up just as much now as it did in 2017, and if you somehow haven't heard it before, I do think it is worth a listen. See major labels, I'm advertising the track for you. Now, of course, the trouble with this album came when it actually came to turning the idea behind this track into a full album experience. And Calvin Harris's idea of making an album out of Slide seemed to be just turn that track into a formula and keep trying to throw the same idea at the wall over and over with different guests. And that did work to some extent at first. Like, before the album released, he did have me further intrigued with tracks like Heatstroke, which combined the efforts of Young Thug, Pharrell, and Ariana Grande and got them to somehow make some kind of sense together at the time. And once the album dropped, I was for once actually interested to see if he could pull through an experience as fun as those singles implied. I might have railed against the title in my original video, but I did low-key kind of like it, being like a clever flip on how rendering out final masters of tracks in Pro Tools is called bouncing, and you usually save the file in the .wav format, so these are literally funk wave bounces. In any case, it's a much more clever title than I Created Disco or Motion. So I had just gotten back from a once-in-a-lifetime family vacation to London. I was actually kind of pumped to get into it. And as I sat through its short 38 minutes of ideas, my enthusiasm kept slowly draining out of me. And at the end, I was like, man, he really didn't have anything to offer outside of that one idea, did he? I rated the album a 6.7 out of 10 back then, still giving it points for standing out from the crowd of mainstream EDM, and marginally feeling like a weird risk for him in the grander context of his catalog, but finding the execution to be disappointingly one note. But now it's been 5 years since that album. Even a year after it released, the album had shrunk on me significantly, and even the better ideas that weren't Slide had lost pretty much all their luster. But by this point, in 2022, This thing is aged almost comically poorly. Like, after we have stuff like Dua Lipa's Future Nostalgia, there's no real novelty in getting a retro disco throwback anymore. You want to see how much people were in the mood for this in 2022. Look how well this album sequel is done. I do still stand by my opinion that Volume 2 is a fair bit better than Volume 1. At least that one felt like it had more than one idea, and it annoyed me a fair bit less. But yeah, beyond Slide, every track on here has some element to it that prevents it from working in the same way that one did. Even the tracks I like. Cash Out starts promising with a really solid verse from Schoolboy Q and a solid hook from Party Next Door. This track would be great if not for getting ruined by Dram of all people, who felt the need to name drop the one big hit he had at the time, like this was an unintentional signal that Dram was going to be a one-hit wonder and never heard from again. And that is almost exactly what happened. Well, he hasn't completely disappeared. He now goes by the much bigger mouthful of a name, Shelly FKA Dram, but he hasn't bothered the charts since. I think he released one album last year that pretty much flew under everyone's radar, and that's all we've heard out of him since 2017. Which is, I suppose, a shame, since I do remember him getting a lot of acclaim back in the day. Anyway, Heatstroke, that used to be a favorite back in the day. I thought it was interesting that there was an attempt to combine the efforts of Young Thug, Pharrell, and Ariana Grande, and that it had one of the better instrumentals. But in retrospect, Thugger and Ariana make no goddamn sense on the same track together. Even if their performances are good in a vacuum, and this is still a much more energetic Young Thug performance than the one he gave in Volume 2, the tonal jump between them is super wide and jarring. I think we used to excuse it because Pharrell was trying to act as like a bridge between the two, but he really doesn't. I barely even notice he's on the track at all. Also, the hook, he feels like it's copying off of Jamie XX's I Know There's Gonna Be Good Times, right down to Young Thug delivering it in almost the exact same way as he did on that track. Like, this is still pretty decent. I like how it plays out instrumentally, but with all due respect, Calvin Harris, Jamie XX, you ain't. I remember liking Faking It. Coming back to it, I do still like Kehlani's performance on it. I think it's pretty catchy without being annoying, and for once doesn't actually sound like it's copy-pasted off of Slide. But of course, I had completely forgotten about Lil Yachty and his freaking corny-ass verse about eating pizza off someone's face, which comes right the fuck out of nowhere. You could say he really blew it like a cello. And of course, I remember liking Feels when this first came out. It might have the catchiest sets of hooks this album ever had to offer, but oh my god, does this track get on my nerves nowadays. That catchiness is no longer an asset, as it's just crept in my head without warning at various points throughout the past couple of years, and it became the real mascot for how I feel about this album as a whole. Like, Katy Perry exists, Big Sean's verse feels totally disconnected from the rest of the track, Pharrell is somehow way more annoying than either of them, and to top it all off, the track's freaking called Feels. Like, the word feels used to even be part of my regular reviewing vocabulary before 2017, and while it didn't hit me immediately that this was what was happening, this track really highlighted to me how uncool that word was, and I became consistently embarrassed at my previous use of the word pretty much any time after this album dropped. And then there's the tracks I wasn't even a fan of when I first heard them. Rollin' mainly doesn't work, not because of Future and Khalid, they don't have much chemistry together, but they don't openly clash either. Now that track loses me because of the instrumental, which, again, is copied off Slide, but made way more lumbering and awkward. Like, Slide was really smooth, but this is the exact opposite of smooth. It's like driving over a road under construction, it's just super bumpy. Similar story with Prayers Up with Travis Scott and A-Track, although that one has the extra disadvantage of having Travis Scott. We all like Travis Scott in 2022, right? I mean, I guess it was kinda neat how varied his flow was. Back when I originally reviewed the album, I mistook him for two different people, thinking A-Track was another rapper. Although A-Track is of course not a rapper, he's a DJ, possibly best known for being one half of Duck Sauce, and is pretty much just here to throw in some half-assed DJ scratching at the end of the track that is so barely present you could theoretically miss it altogether. Holiday has Snoop Dogg offering a verse just as weirdly creepy in retrospect as his verse on this album's sequel, alongside forgettable performances from John Legend and Takeoff. Hard to Love is a mediocre closer with a tired and generic performance from Jesse Reyes that leaves me completely burnt out on everything about the sound of this album by the end of it. And of course, the worst cut is still probably Skirt on Me with Nicki Minaj. Ridiculous title aside, Her voice is covered in auto-tune pretty much the whole time, and she's trying on a fake Jamaican accent and going over a plastic reggaeton-ish beat. Not even to get into her corny verse in the middle where she's blunt like Emily Blunt. Yeah, this was trash from the very first time I heard it, and it is just as trash now. And all this adds up to an album that somehow became a chore to get through despite only being 38 minutes total over 10 tracks. It's almost kind of impressive how he managed to sour me so much on a concept I initially really liked, and really just cements how much lightning in a bottle he captured when he made Slide. I mean, let's not forget, back in the day, a lot of us looked at the idea for Slide and thought it had the potential to go horribly wrong on paper, and yet it still stands up as one of my favorite hit songs of the 2010s and one of my favorite Calvin Harris tracks ever. But the rest of this album fulfills the potential of that idea to go wrong. I do still think this album is better than 18 Months or Motion, since it at least had an interesting idea at its core and it didn't feel like it was just rotely chasing the trends of the time. And as much as it did annoy me, it still didn't annoy me nearly as much as his ironic sense of humor on I Created Disco. For as much as I have shit on this album throughout this video, it is not terrible all the way down. It at least starts decently well, and it's generally all really well produced for what it is. If this were an all-instrumental album, I'd find it pleasant enough. But I also feel like being this well produced should be the baseline of expectation for an artist as successful as he is. So, yeah, like, I was disappointed in this album in my original review, but even then I was still probably too nice to this thing. This is unbearably mediocre and a waste of potential. Also, a lot of my associations with it now are from copyright headaches, so thank you. I originally gave this a 6.7 out of 10, but now I think I am going to downgrade it to a 5.3. And even then, that's probably being generous. So, I'm gonna leave it at that. But of course, this is just my opinion. You can feel free to disagree with it, but I'd like to hear your thoughts, so leave the comments in the comment thing down there. Shout out to my Patreon supporters. They're awesome people. You want to add yourself to that list, link to my Patreon is in the description. But yeah, that's pretty much it. That's all for today. See you next time.